This meeting of the Hingham Select Board is called to order. This meeting is being held in person and/or remotely as an alternate means of public access pursuant to Chapter 2 of the Acts of 2023 and all other applicable laws temporarily amending certain provisions of the open meeting law. You are hereby advised that this meeting and all communications during this meeting may be recorded by the town of Hingham in accordance with the open meeting law. If any participant wishes to record this meeting, please notify the chair at the start of the meeting in accordance with Mass General Law, Chapter 30A, Section 20F, so that the chair may inform all other participants of said recording. If anybody is recording this meeting, please notify me at this time. All right, seeing none, I want to know for the record participated in tonight's meeting. Our select board members, myself, William Ramsey, Chair, Board Member Elizabeth Klein, and Board Member Joseph Fisher. We do have members of the school committee joining us this evening, but they do not have a posted meeting and they do not have a quorum. All right, so I want to appreciate everybody joining us this evening. This is the second of our public information session regarding the proposed override. How we're going to proceed this evening is we are going to, the panelists are going to do a presentation. The presentation will go roughly about 45 or 50 minutes. Once the presentation is over, we will take questions from those in attendance. There's two ways you can ask questions this evening. You can do it through the chat function. If you look to the bottom right of your screen, there's a chat function and you can type your question in there. We'll go there first when fielding questions, or you can also physically, you can also raise your hand with the raise hand function, and we'll also look there as well. I'm going to ask everybody if you could hold your questions to the end of the presentation, and then we will take questions as they come in, and we will stay as long as people have questions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Town Administrator Tom Mayo to start us off.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Billy. Appreciate it. I think Art is going to share our presentation, and I'll start walking everyone through those slides. Laid plans, right? Isn't there a saying around that? There we go. Perfect. Thank you very much, Art. Okay, so tonight is our technically our third public information session. We had one over at Linden Ponds, and we had one just the other day here at Town Hall in person. So we wanted to do one by Zoom to make sure everybody who wanted to participate was able to do so. Next slide. Bill walked through our introductions. So the next thing we'll talk about in the next couple of slides will be how we got here, a little bit of a walk down memory lane. I'll talk about a couple of the just basic concepts around Prop 2.5 so people understand what we're talking about when we discuss things like overrides. I'll walk folks through some override and implications of the override. And then we have our team will dig into some of the related articles, tax relief, other override implications, as well as circling back to the town meeting and town election specifics. And then I'll highlight some available information at the end of the discussion. Next slide. Okay, so regarding the discussion as a whole, I thought it would be worthwhile to set the table with an executive summary slide. I'm going to walk through this because this really summarizes the whole concept of what we're doing, of what we're proposing. So town meeting will be asked to consider two votes on a balanced budget and an override. This will all be done within Article 6 this year. And so a balanced budget will be the first vote within Article 6. It will be presented very much as it always is. It will match, the balanced budget will match the service delivery to the available revenue. And what that does is fund the majority of the town's operating budget. In order for the balanced the town meeting must pass the balanced budget to ensure the delivery of the essential services built into the normal town operating budget. So that's the balanced budget. That's the first component. If you have your book, which I think most people got your town meeting warrant in the mail over the weekend, you'll see Article 6 presented very much as it usually is, with the exception of the last page in Article 6, which is the proposed override. And that's the second component of this slide. The override and the financial management plan together are the plan for the override. So the first thing it does, it addresses the significant budget deficit to deliver our level services. So there's $6 million of unfunded level services right now that will need to, that are a component of the proposed override. We're also including in that proposed override some additional requests, and we'll walk everyone through those. A component of the override is what we're referring to as a financial management plan. And what that plan is intending to do is to commit 3 different boards, as well as myself and the superintendent, to budget growth caps and ensuring the public that we will not exceed those guaranteed budget or capped budget growths within the window employed by the financial management plan. Again, we'll get into that in more detail. Both of these components of Article 6, the balanced budget and the override, have been unanimously recommended by the Select Board and the Advisory Committee. I'd also note that the financial management plan has already been executed. In the event that the override passes at town meeting, it would be in place. All 3 boards, again, have committed to those, to the commitments identified within that plan, which we will go through. And then also just to note that the override needs to pass a majority vote through the town election on Saturday, the 29th. Next slide. Okay, so we'll walk through a little bit of walk down memory lane, how we got here, just a couple of slides on that. So the first is to highlight, a couple of uncomfortable facts that the town, I believe, I like to say, we all did eyes wide open. These last 2 budgets, I'll note, have been passed unanimously at town meeting with unanimous support of the board, the advisory committee, and the school committee in both years. In FY24, the budget deficit resulted from adding a lot of critical capacity throughout the pandemic, both in FY22 and in 23. The cost of providing our normal ongoing services has really long outpaced our revenue growth. And that is, in fact, in large part, that's driven by 2 components. One is we have some high cost drivers. That includes inflation, personnel costs, health insurance costs, et cetera. Exacerbated by low revenue drivers, which Hingham has historically been able to overcome some of our high costs through high revenue, through realizing higher revenue through things like commercial and residential development, but that has been drying up pre-pandemic and certainly throughout the pandemic. So the other thing that we did was that we as a town identified optimizing federal COVID-19 funds as a priority. We did that, and then we utilized local reserves as well to finalize and offset the deficits created in FY22 and 23, in essence, with one-time money. So it comes down to 2 options at this point. We can either reduce services, balance the FY24 budget, or we need to raise revenue through an override in order to maintain those current operations. Next slide. So this is just an itemization of some of how we got here back in FY22. We added a lot of capacity in FY22, identified as ongoing and COVID-19 related. That capacity has been added, and we've been operating with that capacity now for a couple of years. In FY23, we identified, we settled 4 different union contracts, as well as addressed a longstanding reclassification problem with our non-union personnel that hadn't been done in 19 years. So we did that in FY23. And both FY22 and 23, I'll remind everyone again, were passed at town meeting unanimously and by unanimous vote of the Select Board, Advisory Committee, and the School Committee. Next slide. In FY20, or excuse me, at ATM 21 for FY22, Advisory Committee Chair Bob Curley at the time noted that for fiscal year 23, the town faces this prospect of an override to address what is essentially a structural deficit in the budget. Moving on to ATM of 22, referring to FY23 at this point, the town needs to reconcile revenues with expenses through an override. It is expected that an override will be placed before the citizens at the 2023 annual town meeting and the 2023 annual election, referring to FY24. This is where we're at now. The advisory chair at the time, Julie Straley, noted that rather than put together an override in a year when we still had a number of federal dollars available, it would be best to hold off on that and do it when the federal dollars were gone, and we could move forward with an override here in 2023 for FY24. And again, that's what we're doing. Next slide, please. Okay, I'll turn it over to Liz for a couple of slides.
Great, thanks so much, Tom. At the annual town meeting in May 2021, the advisory committee reported that we were creating a structural deficit in the budget for FY22, that municipal and school operations were lean, many initiatives and positions were still going unfunded, the potential need for an override in FY23, and recommended the formation of an override study group. In August 2021, the Sustainable Budget Task Force was formed. It was intentionally not called an override study group, as we were committed to not having a foregone conclusion before we started the process. The task force was comprised of a municipal, school, and a former AdCom leader to work candidly and collaboratively, representing the perspectives of Select Board, School Committee, and Advisory Committee. The task force was asked to create a long-term financial plan and framework that sought to reconcile available revenue with the level of services requested by citizens. We started by analyzing expenditures across town, focusing on the 4 largest budgets: education, Department of Public Works, police, and fire. Next slide, please. The Sustainable Budget Task Force reported its findings on February 1st, 2022. The main takeaways are: the town was experiencing increasing budget pressure from expenditure growth exceeding revenue growth prior to the pandemic. Hingham should seek both tax and non-tax revenue to provide high-quality municipal and school services. New revenue sources require time. They are not solutions for the budget gap in the short term. Both municipal and school departments should target a 3.5% expenditure growth rate after an override in future years to better align expenses with available revenue. The town should consider closing the FY23 budget deficit by using remaining federal and other one-time funds. The town should consider proposing a potential override in FY24 to maintain or grow services. Next slide. The Sustainable Budget Task Force has continued to meet and has been working on implementing many of the recommendations, including the following: exploring economic development opportunities, working with the Massachusetts Municipal Association and state legislators to lobby for increased local aid, exploring potential new non-tax revenue sources, such as a real estate transfer fee and/or marijuana zoning changes, analyzing municipal and school fees to see if adjustments are necessary, analyzing town-owned real property for potential disposition, targeting specific growth rates for operating budgets, which is part of the FY24 to 28 financial management plan, and identifying ways to supplement the capital outlay budget. Next slide, thank you. In thinking about how we got here, it's important to note that the town also updated its master plan in 2021. The master plan lays out a vision for the town from now till 2035. And the master plan articulates the following goals: 1, to honor town character; 2, protect the environment and prepare for the impacts of climate change; 3, improve safety for all modes of travel and reduce traffic congestion; 4, provide a variety of housing to encourage population diversity and aging in the community; 5, support a vibrant, resilient local economy. 6, provide high-quality services that support the health and wellness of residents of all ages. And 7, to provide public facilities and infrastructure that support the town's need to manage growth in town services. The proposed budget with the override is aligned with the master plan goals and the community's shared vision. The proposed budget represents the necessary resources to execute the master plan. With that context, I will transition back to Tom to talk about what an override is.
Doesn't do me any good to talk to myself without unmuting and coming back on video. Sorry, everybody. Okay, thank you very much, Liz. So as we get into the next part of the presentation, we will walk you through two main potential outcomes. The first is if the override passes as presented. We will discuss all of the implications of this scenario, including the programs that will be funded, the commitments being made, and the tax impacts of that scenario. We will also discuss a scenario where the override fails. This will include the programs that will be cut. There would be no commitments regarding growth rates or length of time between overrides, as the proposed financial management plan is only in effect if the override passes. Next slide, please. So an override, just so everyone understands, is a voter approved permanent tax increase. It's designed to provide a community with the ability to generate sufficient revenues and to fund costs that are likely to continue into the future, such as annual operating and fixed expenses. Next slide. There are two ways that the override needs to be passed. One is at town meeting on April 24th, and the second is at the election on April 29th, and both are majority votes required. Okay, and as I just said, we'll walk through two scenarios for the override and its implications. Next slide. Okay, so this slide is really intended to show the impact of the balanced budget and an override passage. So the level services funded, what this means is we're going to fund level services that were provided in FY23. We're simply going to provide the same level of services in FY24. That is the $6 million that we'll walk through here in a minute. Then on top of that, we have some additional requests. The additional requests provide critical services to the school and the municipal departments and to ensure that they, in fact, are being funded. And again, this scenario includes a financial management plan that has been pre-negotiated and will be put in place, provided a passage of the override as presented. And it provides it for a 3.5% growth rate cap commitment all the way through FY28. And that is accompanied by a commitment to not seek another override within at least that 4-year period. Okay, so this slide is intended to highlight the available revenue. That available revenue is insufficient to meet our anticipated expenditures in FY24. On the left, the green shaded area shows our available revenue, and on the right, the red on the right is showing our anticipated expenditures. The expenditures contingent on the override are shown on the top of the red column, split between the deficit, which is the $6 million, and the additional request, which is the $1.875 million. Next slide. So what we try to do here is to itemize a little bit for you to highlight what is creating the $7.89 million override. The first, again, is the $6,015,216 deficit that the town is in currently. This is fund the level of services provided in FY23 for both the municipal and school departments. In addition to that, the town is funding or proposing to fund $1,375,251 of $2.7 million that had been requested by the municipal and school department heads. And thirdly, the additional requests include a $500,000 being added to the capital budget, which is currently out of compliance with our own financial policy. So we want to bring that back to within compliance for sure. That brings us to a grand total of $7.89 million for the FY24 override. That results in the full amount you'll see in Article 6 on the warrant. Slide. So here I'm just identifying and itemizing all of the components, the different components of the additional requests. Again, it totals the 1.875 million that we saw on the last slide, with 673,000 of that coming from the municipal side, the $701,000 from the school side, and again, the 500,000 identified as a capital outlay need, for the total of 1.875 in additional requests. Okay, next slide. And I'll turn it over to Bill Ramsey.
All right, thank you, Tom. I'm going to dive down a little deeper into some of the additional requests that Tom laid out in scenario 1 and articulate why the select board voted to propose these additional requests. The senior center program coordinator is a position that has not been filled since 2012. When we worked with the director of elder services this year, Jennifer Young, she mentioned this was her #1 priority for staffing at the senior center. It's actually been on our list for several years. It was on there last year, the year before that. We've been unable to fund it for a variety of different reasons. This year, we heard from many active residents of the senior center who also echoed what Jennifer said for the need for the program. Of our 16 peer communities, 12 employ at least 1 program coordinator, 3 employ it at 30 hours a week. This would allow Jennifer to focus on strategic planning, grants, and get her some full-time assistance at the center. This is an additional request of approximately $65,000. Slide. One of the biggest asks too are 4 new firefighters. We currently have firefighters at a minimum staffing shift of approximately 11 firefighters. Because we are low on personnel within the fire department, many firefighters have to be held over and forced to work a double shift once their 24-hour shift ends. This has caused a toil on morale. I mean, imagine having to work a 24-hour shift and you're being told you can't go home because you're now being forced to work another shift. It's difficult to get relief into the firefighters who are forced to work that extra shift. And it cost us approximately $392,000 in overtime. We have done the math in terms of what this would do to add these 4 new firefighters, and it actually would save us money in the long run because it would cut into our overtime budget within the fire department. Additionally, as I said earlier, I would submit to you that these 4 new firefighters are absolutely essential to improve our readiness within our fire department and obviously morale. Slide. The assistant town engineer position is one that we have not had for many years. Our assistant town engineer is involved with absolutely every capital project in town. We listed out a couple of the bigger ones that he's involved with, but there are others as well. Every project that we engage in town, whether it's a public safety building, accounts out there, whether it's seawalls at the harbor, our town engineer is involved with that process. We desperately need a town engineer to assist him and to create an equitable division of labor within the engineering department that would allow us to be more efficient with respect to our capital needs. Slide. We have had significant difficulty keeping an administrative assistant within our Department of Veteran Services. During the past several years, I think we've gone through 2 or 3 administrative assistants to Keith Sherman, our Director of Veteran Services. When we've had exit interviews with the employees who have left, they've commonly cited the lack of compensation within that position. So this request of the 20,000 would add to the additional position. I believe it's currently at 45. This would bring it up to about $65,000. And we believe that, an increase in salary is essential to actually staffing that position, keeping someone interested in the job We have had the benefit of a volunteer in town who has assisted Keith since the departure of the last administrative assistant, and we're just over relying on that volunteer. We believe this is important for our veterans. We believe it's important for our Veteran Services Department, and it's a position that we need to have an employee in there and someone in there who has some longevity to their position. Slide. The sustainability coordinator position was a position added in last year's budget. You may recall we were able to use a state grant to fund that position. That state grant will expire in late October, early November of this past year. Last year, when we voted to add this position, we heard from hundreds of residents about the need and the desire to add the sustainability coordinator. There is increased focus in town, as it should be, on our climate goals, our resiliency. We have a climate action committee that is about to implement the climate action plan. We have significant goals going forward with respect to how the town is going to combat the effects of climate change. We have we've been discussing a resiliency plan for seawater level rising. And this position would obviously be the primary point of contact for addressing those environmental concerns. Slide. And the budgeting software, the last one of the municipal additional requests, we have had to rely on another volunteer to assist us with our budgeting model. It's a program that he used that he's been very gracious with his time and assistance to the town. But we just can't continue to do that. We have to have our own budget modeling. This is new software that our finance team within the select board office had looked at, is comfortable with. As anybody who knows town government, the municipal budget is a primary operational piece of what we do every year. In addition to setting policy for the town, the select board's work on the budget is a driving factor of our focus. This budget software will allow us to do our modeling in-house. We could finally move away from reliance on an outside volunteer to assist us with that. And it could be something that could be shared, used, and benefited by every single department within Town Hall. Slide. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michelle Ayer.
Thank you so much, Bill. Appreciate it. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We sincerely appreciate the engagement from folks prior to getting to town meeting so that we can all be well informed before we attend and before we hit the ballot to make good decisions for our town and for our town's future. Much like Bill just did, I'm going to go through a couple of the scenarios where if the override passes, what the schools would be able to do to enhance the level of instruction for our students. These are initiatives that our superintendent has recommended and that the school committee, advisory committee, and select board have unanimously approved as part of the override budget. The first one is the reduction of technology costs and moving that to capital outlay. This current line item of about $300,000 that is currently been provided through capital outlay will be moved to our operating budget. This is something that the school committee has been talking about for several years, at least since I've been on the committee since 2017. The reason for this move is that this cost is primarily funding Chromebooks that are an annual need for our students. And we want to take these funds, since they are recurring operational expenses, and move them into our operating budget. So it not only serves two purposes, one, moves it into the appropriate category, and two, by moving these funds from capital outlay to operating, it will enhance the amount of money that's available for capital outlay. As we all know around town, the schools, the town has many buildings and many vehicles and other physical plant that needs to be maintained and updated. So this $300,000 being removed from capital outlay to operating will in essence increase the capital outlay budget by the $300,000. Another piece of the override budget for the schools would include the addition of a nursing coordinator. This one gets a fair amount of attention and a fair amount of questions. So I wanted to explain this. This position would be a nurse coordinator who would provide direct supervision to the nurses that are in each of our school buildings. We need this position not only to supervise the other nurses, but to provide for the increased medical needs of our students. We have recently, in recent years, based on COVID and other medical issues that have been identified, it turns out that we have over 1,500 students in our district who have a medical need that needs to be met or supervised within our schools. That is a very large percentage of students. This coordinator position is vital to making sure that students' medical needs are being met, that when nurses are absent from school, either for their own illness or if they're supervising a field trip, which is required, that we have adequate coverage to meet the medical needs of our students. This will also ensure that all state health mandates, including testing and record keeping, are maintained properly, and would provide professional development for our nurses. This is a position, it's not unique to Hingham. Many districts have these. Some of them include Scituate, Marshfield, Weymouth, Hanover, Braintree, Milton, Quincy, and I believe Plymouth. So most of our neighboring towns do have this position as well. If I could have the next slide. Another piece of the override budget would include increased professional development for our teachers and our staff. We need these additional funds because of the very unique needs and challenging needs of our students, particularly as we're coming out of the pandemic. I've said this before, and I'm going to say it again because it bears repeating. The public health emergency of COVID may be over, but the impact on our students is far from over. And our teachers and our staff need to be prepared and ready to meet children where they are, to provide for their educational needs. And you can see on this list, there is a laundry list of programs and initiatives that our schools need to be prepared to deliver to our students. So this additional professional development piece of the budget would go a long way in ensuring all of our staff can meet the very varied needs of all of our students. Next slide. Sorry, can you do the next slide? Thank you. I was going to say I can start anyway because I know it's the gradual elimination of the full day kindergarten tuition. This is a small dollar amount. It's about $86,000, but it's really a key component to a school committee commitment that we want to make to our students who enter our schools. Currently, Hingham is one of a very small group of schools that does not fully fund kindergarten and instead relies on tuition. I believe there are less than 25 towns in the Commonwealth that charge a tuition-based full-day kindergarten program, and we are one of just 4 towns on the South Shore that do the same. Kindergarten is incredibly important to students today. It is not the kindergarten I went to. It is an academic day for the students, and being there for a full day is essential for their learning. It's interesting to think back that in Hingham, we proposed full day kindergarten in 2000. The year 2000 was when full day kindergarten was first proposed in Hingham. It wasn't implemented in Hingham until 2015. It took us 15 years just to get to having a full day kindergarten program in our town. And when it was approved, it was initially, the goal was to have it be fully funded through the operating budget. But for a variety of reasons, it wasn't approved at town meeting. So we decided to move ahead with full day kindergarten using a tuition based. But it was always the intention to eventually remove the tuition piece from this full day program because it is so integral to the learning needs of our students. If this is in the scenario that we are proposing, the funding of this will reduce the individual kindergarten tuition by $800 per student this year, and it will result in a gradual elimination of the full day kindergarten. We think this is a very thoughtful approach to eliminating this individual tuition program and ultimately getting to a fully funded program that the town would support through the operating budget within the next 5 years. But I do want to be clear, we are not eliminating it today. We are simply using this override to reduce the tuition by $800 per family. With that, I will turn it back over to Bill to discuss capital outlay.
Michelle, thank you. One of the requests is $500,000 for our capital outlay budget. We have significantly underfunded our capital outlay budget for many years. The town's fiscal policy advocates that the budget be between 3% and 6% of the town's total operating budget for the fiscal year that the budget is being proposed. We haven't even come close to that in the 3 years I've been on the board. The level services request is approximately $2.8 million. That's about 2.7%. The additional $500,000 would get us up a little bit, I think a little bit above that 3%, which would put us into compliance with our capital outlay needs. Slide. And this is the reason why we need it. As you can see, this is one of the charts that our capital outlay committee works with Tom, Michelle, and Art on with respect to capital needs. We have deferred many DPW requests with respect to back to capital outlay. You know, every year our DPW superintendent comes to us asking for heavy equipment that is used at our transfer station, used, you know, a lot of it's multi-purpose, a lot of it is used to for plowing operations, for moving soil operations. And the DPW, like any DPW, has significant capital needs. We have been unable to meet those needs and have deferred them to the point where our DPW superintendent has expressed concerns about being able to operate at the high standards that we've become accustomed to. But this is a good example of our deferral list, and we've been deferring year after year after year, kicking the can down the road, not getting the equipment that he needs at DPW. With that, I will turn it over to Joe.
Great, thank you, Bill. So you heard mention of a financial management plan. And I just wanted to briefly explain what that is, and then in conjunction with the school committee, sort of go into it in a little more detail. But the financial management plan is a tri-party agreement involving the select board, the school committee, and the advisory committee. And it really goes hand in hand with any override proposal, so that the town knows the fiscal discipline that our committee, the select board, school committee, and advisory committee will be following. In fact, I'm going to read just the introductory paragraph of the financial management plan. It begins, "The purpose of this document is to make a public commitment to the residents and taxpayers of the town of Hingham to implement a financial management plan in conjunction with a proposed operational override for fiscal year 2024. The select board, school committee, and advisory committee acknowledge the necessity of following the plan's parameters and pledge to work together in fiscal years 2024 to 2028 in order to achieve balanced budgets consistent with the plan's fiscal constraints." That is, in fact, the purpose and mission of the financial management plan. I will turn it now to my colleague, Nes Carenti, on the school committee.
Thanks so much, Joe. As Joe mentioned, the three boards had unanimously adopted the financial management plan for fiscal years 24 through 28. The town administrator and school superintendent also signed on, signaling agreement to implement and manage to the terms of the plan. Okay, next slide, please. So Hingham has been successful in utilizing a financial management plan in the past. In May of 2020, at the height of the pandemic, the select board, school committee, and advisory committee put a collaborative management framework in place that helped the town navigate through the financial uncertainty of the pandemic. And we're now utilizing that helpful framework to manage to balanced budgets over the next few years. On this slide, it shows the new financial management plan will govern fiscal years 24 through 28. The key terms include that the school department and municipal departments will cap annual budget growth at 3.5%. There will be no override until fiscal 28 at the earliest. The school department will use the reserve fund transfer process for certain special ed costs that rise above 2% increase. These costs can vary greatly from year to year with the unpredictable impact on the school department budget. So thought to take that process and move it through the reserve fund transfer process. It's also important to note that the MOU will become void should any changes to the recommended override be made at town meeting, or if it doesn't pass at both town meeting and the town election. For example, if there's a change in the department's FY24 recommended budget, the MOU becomes a void. And the next slide, I will pass back over to Joe.
Great. So some highlights of the financial plan. It's our commitment to seek efficiencies in operations, to pursue new growth, to continue to fund capital and maintain fund balance within financial policy guidelines, continue to fund OPEB, continue to advance tax relief programs, to seek new non-tax revenue sources, and to maintain the town's AAA credit rating. And with that, I will turn it back to Liz Klein.
Great, thanks so much, Joe. So you've heard about what's included in the override from a services perspective. Now I will review the tax impact. What does this actually mean for you? You may recognize this chart from the fall when we were talking about large capital projects and the tax impact. Here you can see the tax impact at various levels of assessed property values. This is intended to show a range and magnitude of the tax impact. For the 50th percentile, the green bar in the middle, that represents the median assessed property value. So the tax increase due to the override is $751 in FY24. The FY24 estimated tax bill with the override will increase by 7.8%. I've heard a few questions about this percentage increase, so want to be clear that the FY24 estimated tax bill will increase by the annual allowable tax increase of 2.5%, the CPA surcharge, and existing excluded debt, including foster school and the public safety facility debt, which was approved in the fall. So those charges are regardless of if the override passes. So the 7.8% represents the additional increase with the override. And this chart shows only the increase in year one or FY24. Next slide, thank you. This next chart shows the estimated increase over the next 5 years for the median property. The green bar in FY23 represents your current tax bill. That becomes the base bill for FY24, which again includes the annual allowable tax increase of 2.5%, the CPA surcharge, and existing excluded debt. The orange bar represents the estimated tax increase for the approved foster school and public safety facility. The purple bar represents the estimated tax increase of the override. The tax increase from the override will be permanent. The tax increase from foster and the public safety building peaks in FY29, which you can't see on this chart, but it peaks in FY29 and then begins to decline in FY30. Next slide. The tax impact calculator on the town website will show the estimated tax impact for your specific address. If you enter your street and then house or apartment number, the estimated tax increase for next year, FY24, will appear. So I encourage you to take a look into this to understand what the override means for you and your family, taking into account the level of services you value and the shared vision for our community. Next slide. This chart shows the average single-family property tax bill for Hingham and our benchmark communities. This is one of the data points the Sustainable Budget Task Force analyzed during our work, and we thought it was important to update it based on the proposed override to give context. You can see here that Hingham is near the middle at number 11. Next slide. So rolling that data forward to next year, the FY24 average single family property tax bill with the override is still near the middle. It moves us slightly to number 10. It's important to keep in mind that this chart assumes no other communities pass an override or a debt exclusion, which we know is highly unlikely. So this is a conservative estimate of our relative tax bills to our other benchmark communities. So while we know that a proposed tax increase will not be easy for people to absorb, it is important to keep in mind the relative nature of the tax levels, what we consider high and low, and what's reasonable. So this, I think, does give a fair just representation of what it costs to live in these towns and support the services and the level of services that we want in the town that we live in. I will pass it back over to Joe to discuss the other scenario 2.
Thank you, Liz. So you've heard from others about what we're looking for in terms of an override. And now I'm the bad news bear and discussing what happens if the override does not pass and only the balanced budget passes. And just so we're clear, the green on the left-hand side of this slide shows the $143.9 million budget, which would be the balanced budget. And the 7.8 or 7.9 million override is divided into two categories on the right-hand side in the red. There's the $6 million, as Tom explained, and then the 1.875. So what I'm going to be talking about now is that $6 million. What happens if we don't get the override, and which means we don't get the $6 million, which is the amount needed to continue funding level services. Bill spoke to you about what we're asking for in terms of the 1.875. Now I'm going to be addressing that $6 million gap that will arise if the override does not pass. So we can go to the next slide. Yes, that's illustrative of what happens if the override doesn't pass. We have a big yellow mark throughout a lot of budgets here. So let's go to the next slide, please. So if the balanced budget only passes, meaning no override, then that will kick in starting July 1st of 2023, and the town will need to decrease services and reduce personnel in order to cut expenditures by $6 million. That means the town will need to offer a lower level of services than currently provided. None of the additional requests that we've asked for would be available. And the financial management plan that we worked so hard to negotiate and achieve would not be there. Let's go to the next slide. The balanced budget requirement. State law requires Hingham to adopt a balanced budget, which is the budget that matches between revenue and expenditures. And as a result of that, there would be a projected deficit of $6 million, which is the amount we would need for level services over and above the balanced budget. And so to manage that, the school budget would be reduced by 3.9 million and the municipal budget would be reduced by 2.1 million, which is a 65-35 split of that $6 million deficit. And again, if the override does not pass, reductions go into effect starting July 1st, 2023. Next slide. So we've got the reductions on the school side of 3.9 million, on the municipal side of 2.1 million. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Adams, who will now take us through the impact on the schools, and then I'll pick up again to discuss the impact on municipal government. Dr. Adams.
Good evening, everyone. On this slide, you'll see an overview of the proposed reductions by the school administration in the scenario that the override does not pass. It will include an approximately 46.1 FTEs or staffing positions. You'll see outline that could include at the elementary level, 20.8 staffing positions, at our middle school, 10.2 staffing positions, at our high school, 11.1 staffing positions, a decrease in our athletic programs, specifically sub-varsity or freshman sports, elimination of some central office staff, reduction in our curriculum and professional development that we're able to provide, reduction in our student services administration that support our special education students and staff, reduction in technology, as well as proposed fees for transportation to bring us to the deficit. Next slide. The reductions would indicate reductions in teachers, administrators, paraprofessionals, and administrative assistants. Again, approximately 46.1 staffing positions. Those would impact class sizes at all levels, the eliminations of elective courses at our middle school and high school. It reduces our ability to continue to meet student needs as a result of the pandemic, the implementation of what is called our multi-tiered systems of support. That's our ability to be able to address students' needs when they're struggling in classrooms and literacy and math, both at our elementary and at our middle school level. A decrease in our support for special education programming, specifically with the elimination of some special education administrators, reduces our ability to respond to faculty, staff, and families, thus impacting our students, and increased administrative demands in our school offices. In the next slide, we discuss those reductions in curriculum, textbooks, and materials. During the pandemic, much of our textbook adoptions, our curriculum adoptions were slowed. That we would continue not to be able to fund needed materials, new textbooks for our schools, for our students. Significant impact in our ability to provide consumable materials, visual arts materials, technology materials for science labs, reduced opportunities for our staff to continue to develop their skills, reduced ability to provide the professional development offerings needed for our teachers to continue to develop, reduced staffing to support the implementation of a new K-5 reading program and the related professional development. In the next slide, impacting our high school and middle school, the elimination of sub-varsity sports, often called freshman sports, reduces our ability to provide for athletic programming, which we know is so important for many students for their social emotional learning needs, and reduction of clubs at the high school and perhaps instituting a fee for our clubs at the high school, reduction of middle school clubs. Those are all very important pieces. Many students come to school just for those activities and look forward to them and the socialization that they provide. The reduction of late buses for our middle school and high school, that also is an opportunity for students to get extra help, not having that ability to catch a late bus to get home. In the next slide, in order to balance the budget because of those proposed reductions, we discuss proposed new fees, which include new transportation fees for all students grades 7 through 12, fees for high school activities, a fee for our grade 5 elementary instrumental music. We believe all of these fees have an impact in our ability to meet the needs of students across all grades. I'll pass it off now back to the Select Board Member Fisher.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Adams. And I would note that you are a signer of the financial management plan. And I know that you are committed, assuming that we do get the override, to make sure that the schools achieve the financial goals that are in that plan to keep the growth to 3.5%. And hopefully with the institution of the financial management plan and the override, all of the things that you just discussed, we won't have to discuss again. But unfortunately, we do have to consider what happens if the override does not pass. Turning to the municipal side, it would result in general government services reductions of about 4.7 FTEs. It would reduce our capacity to implement the master plan goals, objectives that the town has invested substantial time and a commitment. Those opportunities really would be lost. It would slow economic development. It would reduce efficiency and capacity across town. The elimination of the assistant town administrator would severely impact the activities of the town. There would be facilities that would need to be closed, the GAR hall. It would reduce the GIS capacity to inform strategic decision-making, decrease the maintenance of municipal facilities, reduce the town's ability to communicate with the public. It would slow our sustainability initiatives. The list goes on, but those would be the impacts if we do not have the override pass. Next slide, please. Public safety reductions of 3.6 FTEs. Eliminate the SRO, which would reduce police support to school safety and security. Eliminate the community crisis clinician, which would diminish the ability to support community members with mental health crises. Reduce the animal control capacity, reduce support for police administration. It would decrease the fire minimum staffing from 11 to 9 for certain shifts. Eliminate fire CPR training for school and municipal employees. Next slide. For public works, we're talking about a reduction of 9 FTEs, reducing trash and recycling pickup, delay the filling of potholes, limit line painting. None of these are things that are desirable, but they are unfortunately the impacts if in fact the override does not pass. Next slide, please. Human services reductions, we're talking 2.1 FTEs. Decrease the town's ability to provide public health services, eliminate the town's social worker position, and significantly reduce senior center transportation programs, which we were just at a senior center event today, and that is, believe me, the last thing we want to do in this town. Next slide. From culture and recreation perspectives, we're talking about a reduction of about $469 million, which will result in multiple FTEs. You can see the list here, the impact on our field maintenance program, the library, and town ceremonies. All of those things are at the core of the town's character, and unfortunately, they would be adversely impacted if, in fact, the override does not pass. Liz, I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thanks so much, Joe. So what else is the town doing? Next slide. There are 6 proposed articles to consider by town meeting on April 24th, which came from Sustainable Budget Task Force report recommendations. The first is Article 12, the Tax Mitigation Stabilization Fund. This would create a separate new fund to set aside a portion of surplus funds in a given year as a measure to mitigate the likely frequency of future operating override requests. This we saw as a best practice by other towns, our neighboring towns, as well as benchmark towns. And we thought it was a useful tool to go along with the override. And again, as part of that financial management plan, stretching out the frequency of the next needed override. Article 13 is a capital stabilization fund. This would create a separate new stabilization fund to set aside a portion of surplus funds each year as a measure to increase support for capital improvements. And it's important to note that any money put in or taken out of these funds would need town meeting approval. So certainly citizens would be aware of those actions and be part of that process. Article 14 is the sale of property, which would allow the sale of 32 Rockwood Road and deposit proceeds into the new capital stabilization fund if it's created at town meeting. The town is also evaluating other municipal properties that can be sold for revenue. Article 20 and 21 relate to plumbing and gas and electrical permit fees. These deal with increasing building fees to better align them to the expense of providing these services. And then Article 22 is the naming bylaw. The updated naming bylaw is intended to increase the town's ability to attract private funds and donations to support capital projects, which will serve as an important component of the town's strategy to help defray the tax impact of debt exclusions on residents and businesses. Next slide. There are over 12 tax relief programs offered by the town. If you're unsure if you qualify, please reach out to the assessor's office. They're happy to help. And in addition to these 12, I did also want to note 2 other things that are happening. There's a tax deferral program to help citizens who kind of fall into being house rich and income poor. So if you have a fixed income, but have a lot of equity in your home or own your home, that is a good option for people. We have also brought back a taxation aid committee. That committee is people are being appointed and staffed to get that up and running. And that's really designed to help people, citizens that need help with tax relief for a very specific acute situation. Might be a job loss or a child with an illness. Those are situations that can be evaluated on a case-by-case basis to help our citizens. Next slide. The town continues to engage in an active outreach campaign, which has resulted in a 300% increase in participation in the senior means tested tax exemption program this year. There are also 3 articles related to tax release for town meeting to consider on April 24th, including Article 17, in which the select board is proposing doubling all current statutory exemptions. We will continue to provide tax relief to the fullest extent possible. Now I will pass it back over to Tom to discuss the logistics of town meeting and the election.
Great, thank you very much, Liz. So just a few logistical slides to make sure everyone remembers some of the basics. First is that annual town meeting is held at the high school. It'll be this year, it'll be on Monday, April 24th at 7 p.m. And the election will be held on Saturday, April 29th. Next slide. Remember that in order for an override to pass, it needs to pass at both town meeting on April 24th and at the town election as a ballot question on April 29th. The override, if you've had a chance to look on page 33 of your warrant, you'll see the way the override is presented in the warrant book. And again, it's the balanced budget and the override votes that will be part of warrant Article 6 this year, rather than just the traditional basic Article 6. We now have this component of the additional override on top of the balanced budget. And that's again shown on page 33 of your warrant book. Next slide. On the ballot, you'll see a single ballot question. It is ballot question 1, and it will read, shall the town of Hingham be allowed to assess an additional $7,890,467 in real estate and personal property taxes for the purposes of funding the operating budgets of the town and the public schools for the fiscal year beginning July 1st, 2023. A little bit of additional information just so everyone knows where to go to become informed should you want to do that. Next slide. We have a very robust override page on the town website. There's a button right at the top of the main page of the website that reads FY24 override. Please utilize that, and you'll see there's a lot of information in there, including 5, well, soon to be 5, currently 4, videos intended to help people understand the components of what we're proposing. Slide. And the school department also has a lot of information explaining the override and the impacts of the of the proposed override or it failing and passing. And next slide. To the extent that anyone has any questions, again, as Bill said at the beginning, at the outset of this meeting, we'll take questions here tonight and stay as long as we need to. You can also visit the website to become informed, or if you would prefer, you can email us directly at override@hingham-ma.gov. And I'll turn it back to Bill.
All right, Tom, thank you. At this point, I'm going to ask all the panelists to turn their cameras back on and join me here in the panel discussion. For anyone of the public who has a question, you can ask questions two ways. You can put it into the chat function, the bottom right of the screen, and we will take those chat questions. Or you can use the raise hand function through the software, and we can call you on. We'll call you there too. When I call on you, I'm going to ask you to state your name and address for the record, and I will answer your question, or I will direct it toward the appropriate panelist. If you have a comment, you can feel free to engage in commentary as well. I'll just ask you to keep your comments at 2 minutes. Okay, and I see someone has a hand up. Let me see who that is. That Sky Thaxter. I saw a hand. Yeah, Sky, I'm going to go to you first because you've had your hand up the longest. So, Sky, good evening.
Hey, how you doing? Thank you all for your, can you hear me?
Loud and clear, Sky.
Okay. Thank you all for all your effort and time in this and opening up so that we could ask a few questions. I've tried to go to a couple other meetings and one was at 5 instead of 7. But that's beside the point. I guess my real concern here is that for 2 years, we took money we didn't have and used it to balance the budget. And during those 2 years, we added positions and we did things. And none of you have mentioned the fact, that, I mean, we added positions that we didn't have the money for this year. And so that's what I really am concerned about. As a person, I don't spend money that I don't have in 2 years. I don't go out and buy something that I won't be able to pay for over a period of time. And I realized that we were in COVID and stuff like that, but I don't think that's the proper way. I mean, I've gone through 2 overrides. I've gone through pink slips when I worked for the school system. I know what it's like. I don't want to see programs cut and everything, but I think we've been really irresponsible in the past 2 years to fund with money we didn't have in the future and fund those positions. And now going forward, we need more money. We shouldn't have funded some projects that we had in the school. I mean, we should a foster school, yes. I'm not sure we should have done the police station or the pool or stuff like that if we weren't going to have all this money. So there you go.
All right, Sky, thank you very much. And again, I'd ask people just to state their name and address.
Oh, sorry,
when-
Sky Thaxter, 246
No, okay.
Main Street.
Thanks, Guy. All right. We have another hand raised from Gail Faring. Gail, go ahead. Can we unmute Gail? Here we go. Gail, you should be good now. Gail, are you there? All right, looks like we're having trouble connecting with you. Gail, if you're having trouble hearing us, you can always put a question in the chat. Okay, you see the hand down. Yeah, again, Gail, you can put a question in the chat if you're having trouble with your audio. Does anyone else have a question or a comment for the panel? Laura Marwell, go ahead. Good evening.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Yes, hi, Laura Marwell, 30 Summit Drive, and thank you for taking the time to do this. It's been very helpful. I have a bunch of questions, but I'll try to start with a comment. I just like to sort of add to the previous comment. I went back and I did some looking. I was on advisory from 2008 to 2014. And So I went back and I looked through some warrants, and I noticed that we have now about 450 fewer students than we had in 2018. But we have about 67, this is from the CAFR, and I think some of the numbers, depending on where you get them, can be different, but 67 more employees in the school system. And so kind of getting back on what we were discussing, what the comment earlier, I'm not sure that, I've read that this override will make permanent these positions that were hired in the last couple of years. And so if enrollment is falling off, I'm wondering if, it seems to me that maybe making these positions permanent is not the right long-term choice. So I would just like to add that. It seems to me maybe there's some room there to consider whether we should be keeping all those positions on. And then another question I wanted to ask is, was there never an option for just a level services budget without the additional requests?
All right, so Laura, thank you for the questions. I will take the second question, then I'm going to turn it over to either Michelle or Ness for the first part. There was an option for a level services budget. The decision on the numbers put forth in the override is one that was discussed, debated, and voted on by the select board under Mass General Law. It is a decision of a select board to propose the override numbers. Obviously, we have to propose a balanced budget. I think the moderator is going to refer to a town meeting as the base budget. We got to pass that by law. So that's the first number. We did discuss the option of a level services budget and then an additional needs budget. The reason why the select board, I'm going to speak to my colleagues here, decided not to go with just a level services budget, and we would still have cuts in services with the level services budget. The revenue in the level services budget would not have been sufficient to maintain services. It still would have required cuts. Additionally, in discussion with the advisory committee, with the school committee, and amongst ourselves and at public meetings, obviously, we felt like the additional requests were brought to us and justified by clear and convincing evidence. And lastly, I would add, as a chair this year, I did feel that 3 budgets proposed could get very, very confusing for voters in terms of what they're going to vote on, how they're going to vote. So ultimately, the decision was made by the select board. And I'll turn to select board in consultation with the advisory committee. But I will turn now to Michelle to answer your first question. So thank you.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. You know, it's weird to think how much school has changed even since Ethan and Joe graduated in 2018. There's just so much that has happened. And I think part of the issue with the 32 positions that were added during COVID, they were added to not only help with student learning loss recovery after the pandemic, but they also were there to address some needs that we had identified prior to the pandemic. So those needs still exist. I think another really big piece of it is that the special education out of district expenses have increased dramatically. Just this year alone, out of district tuitions are increasing 14%. We're hopeful that that is a one-time adjustment that the state is making in out-of-district tuition expenses. Typically, they're 2 to 4% increases. Dr. Adams, is that correct? So that's some of the increases that we're seeing. The needs of students have really changed. The out-of-district tuitions have increased significantly for the next fiscal year. And the needs of students, there's sort of a laundry list of things that have been added to the requirements that the schools have to provide for our students, particularly in this post-COVID world. And then the final point is that, and I said it earlier, but the public health piece of it is over, but the kids lost, their education was interrupted for 3 school years. That's 25% of their total 13 years that they're in our schools. And they can't recover from that in one school year. It's definitely going to take some time.
Yeah, well, if I could just respond to that a little bit, I hear what you're saying, but 32 teachers is half of the number of the increase since 2018, as I said, and 450 students fewer. It seems to me, I think I remember that the personnel budget is something like, personnel is about 80% of the budget. And so if you really want to achieve some savings, unfortunately, that's where you really have to think before you make permanent positions that were hired for a temporary situation. So I was also interested in the full day kindergarten, which is not a state mandate, I don't believe yet, right? That is
Correct.
still not state mandated.
Correct.
So if you're going to begin to do this phased drawdown, are you anticipating fewer students? Because at the end of 5 years, how much will you actually not be taking in tuition? If it's 90 grand this year or whatever the number is, how much is that going to be in 5 years? Are you anticipating fewer students so that you can cover that cost, or where is it coming out of?
I think we would anticipate more students coming if the program is fully funded by the townspeople rather than tuition. Because right now people have the choice of paying tuition to Hingham Public Schools to send them here, or to maybe stay at the school where their child went to preschool if they offer a kindergarten program, and they think, well, if I'm paying tuition to Hingham Public Schools, I might as well continue paying the tuition where my child is now. So we would anticipate that we would bring in more students, which is the goal, because we would like them to be here for their entire academic career. And I think, and I fully understand about the enrollment decline. I think one thing that we have to keep in mind is that the 400 plus students that have left the Hingham Public Schools since 2018, that's across 13 grades in 6 different buildings and multiple classrooms. So it's not like 2 classes disappeared. It's 2 children from this classroom, 3 children from that classroom, 1 child from that classroom. So when you spread it out across, it averages like less than 3 students per classroom in the schools.
I think it used to be that for every 25 students, there was 1 employee. So I think it could be done. That was the way it went on the way up when we were talking about increasing enrollment. So it would be nice to see it go the same way on the other direction. But I've taken up a lot of time. So I
No.
what do I cede the floor to? I thank you for your answers.
Thanks, Laura.
Laura, thank you very much for the question. All right,
You're welcome.
Gail Faring did chat a question to us. Gail, I see your question here. She's asked us to review the number of students currently enrolled. Well, sorry, number of students enrolled in our and out. And I think she meant in our school system. So could maybe Dr. Adams, could you just discuss what the current enrollment numbers are?
We have approximately 3,800 students enrolled in the schools. And if the question was about out of district, we have approximately 47 students attending out of district special education schools.
Dr. Adams, thank you. Gail, I think that answered your question. If it didn't, you can feel free to chat a follow-up question. All right. Does anybody else have any questions or comments? Okay, I see a hand up. Laura, do you have a follow-up question? Or did?
Yeah, sorry, I was thinking there were other people here. I was just curious. There are 2 issues brought up. It said that you were looking at some, I think it was Liz who said you're looking at some properties that the town might sell for additional revenue. And then I wanted to be sure I understood. Did you say that there has been an increase in 300% in the senior means tested tax exemption program? Is that an increase in the amount that you are making available for the exemption, or an increase in uptake, meaning 300% more people are taking advantage of it?
Hi, Laura.
Question. Let me turn to Liz to answer that one.
Great, thanks, Bill. Thank you, Laura, for the questions. The 300% is an increase in participation. We're still actually below the budgeted amount for that program. So it's not an increase in cost to the town, but we're happy that people are taking advantage of it. Because that budget allotment is based on the number of people we think or thought would qualify. So we're really aggressively trying to get the word out so that all the people that would qualify can take advantage of it. What was the other question?
Well, first of all, just to comment
the
on that, I'm
town.
not just in the context of the broader conversation, I'm not sure it's a victory that there's a 300% increase in the amount of people using the tax relief programs. So just for context. And then my other question was, what were the properties that the town is looking into selling? Do we have
Sure.
any?
So in terms of the tax relief, I mean, we are committed to providing as much tax relief as possible to our most vulnerable citizens. So that, that is a program that we're committed to. As far as the properties, one of the recommendations of the Sustainable Budget Task Force was to look at and assess any town-owned property and go through a process to see if it was sellable, buildable, what the value might be. So we're still going through that evaluation process. But there are a few that we're looking at that could be possible revenue opportunities. The one that is up for discussion and vote at town meeting is 32 Rockwood Road, which you've probably heard of before. That is a property we have evaluated over the last couple of years, and it's not buildable. We were looking at it for affordable housing, and that is not an option. So we are selling it to the neighbor.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right, I see Mike Jones, 65 Pleasant Street. Looks like he has a comment. Mike, we're gonna try to unmute you, Mike, so you can ask your question. Oh, here it is. Okay, right here. You put in the chat. Thank you. All right, the question is, please provide total school budget. Hold on. Please provide total school budget, including capital outlays, divided by number of students to give us a cost per student. All right, so you want to look at the cost per student. That'd be a good one for you, Dr. Adams, or?
I'm not
Okay.
sure I have that number like right off the top of my head. It's not a calculation because it includes the capital number. So we'd have to like look, I know we've been doing some frequently asked questions. We could add that question to the frequently asked questions.
All right, so
I think
Mike, I'm sorry, go ahead, Michelle.
Sorry. One thing, folks, if they want, on the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, there are some graphs that show where your town lines up by per pupil spending. Hingham actually is on the low end of per pupil spending. That will only show the operating expenses, though. The Department of Education doesn't require or ask that you include the capital improvements made. But I think on average, 1.5 million is school capital outlay. It sort of feels like that's the number over the last couple of years that has been allocated to the schools out of capital.
Yes.
Okay. So.
And that's correct. We're about the middle of when we compare to benchmark districts, we're about middle of the pack, not high and not low.
All right. Next question is from, and the chat is, I'm sorry, Ness, go ahead. I didn't mean to. You want to add?
I think one of the presentations that Dr. Adams had shared early on when we first started looking at the budget in January, the first presentation showed that I think we're fourth from our 20 benchmark towns. We had the fourth lowest out of our benchmark towns. And then as far as the capital goes, I think it bears noting that other districts, it's hard to compare to other districts because there are some districts that don't fund their capital the same way. For instance, Wellesley, we have learned the municipal department funds the capital side of the Wellesley School Department. So we couldn't necessarily compare ourselves to our benchmark towns on the capital side of things.
And thanks to Aisha Opong, our Director of Finance and Operations. She indicates the number is approximately 18,000. And like Ness indicated, that number could mean different things because it's calculated differently district by district.
All right, thank you. All right, next question is from Michael Driscoll. And Michael's question is, what were the pre-pandemic staffing levels for teachers? Was there a need? adding 32 for post-pandemic recovery is permanent change and seems excessive. So the first part of his question there, that'd be a good one for you, Michelle?
Sure, I can start. So the 32 positions were not all teaching positions. There were some administrative positions in there, including 2 directors of special education that were needed to fulfill or to meet the needs of our special education students who comprise almost 25% of students in 2023 compared to previous averages, which were around 12 to 15%. So we've seen a significant increase in the special education needs of our students. We've also added some nurses. Some of the positions were administrative, and then there were interventionists, tutors, and most importantly, counselors that have been needed to be added to the schools. I don't think we can underestimate the social emotional needs of our students today and how much 3 years of interrupted education and socialization impacted these students. Schools had to close to protect the community, and sports stopped, and art stopped, and music stopped, and band was online. And those were really hard for kids to deal with and to get over. So a lot of these positions are there to support the students indirectly versus X number of teachers that were hired to improve their learning loss.
I think it's important to add also that through the budget process with the leadership team, we really sought to what we called efficiencies, where we did make staffing reductions. The primary drivers in the school budget, as Michelle Ayer indicated, is the increase in our out-of-district costs, increased utility costs, and increases due to our collective bargaining agreements. That are the major drivers in the increase in our budget. Really, when you look at the increase, it really is those 3 drivers that amount for that increase. We reduced positions at our high school, at our middle school, as part of the budget process. So we were really thoughtful in thinking about what our current needs are.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Adams. And that just reminded me that we also, I hope this gives some people some comfort. We also completed a year-long staffing audit to ensure that we had the right number of positions in our district, that we were adequately staffed, and that we were mirroring what our benchmark and other comparable districts had in student to staff ratios. And we are, on average, we do not have any more or less than the typical school district in our benchmark towns or our comparable towns.
And if I can just add to that, we, through the Sustainable Budget Task Force and what school committees had reported in prior years, we are a town and a school district that has run lean for a very long time. During 2008, when East opened, we were going through the Great Recession at the time, so didn't fully staff the way that the school needed to be staffed, and still kind of recovering from that year after year. These positions were basically getting us to where I think we needed to fully be in order to be fully staffed. As Michelle mentioned, the staffing audit indicated that we are where we're supposed to be compared to our peer towns. Before those positions were added, we were last on our per pupil spend, and we were very high as far as our teacher-student ratio, even higher than the state average.
Yes, thank you. All right, we have, looks like Mary Louise Madigan has a comment here for the panel. Just for panelists, $65,703,985 is total school budget with capital and override. Thank you for the comment. We have, looks like we have another comment from, yep, go ahead, Michelle.
Sorry, no, just clarifying, there's another comment that says operating budget divided by 3,000 students. Enrollment is about 3,800 students.
Great, thank you.
So it's about 18,000 per student, as Aisha noted in the comments.
Thank you. All right, another follow-up question. Considering the increase in spending requiring an override request, what avenues will be utilized to bridge the gap between spending and revenue to balance a budget in FY28 that is expected to again show a significant shortfall? Should we expect another override? That's an excellent question. Thank you for that. Tom, do you want to talk about how we're going to get through 28? I guess the short question is, no, you should not expect another override until FY28. But I'm going to have Tom explain some of the concepts we're going to put in place to avoid it going through 28. So go ahead, Tom.
Sure. Thank you, Bill. As we said during the presentation, we're going to be creating a tax mitigation stabilization account that is intended to be utilized here in the next 3 years or so to make sure we can get to 28. But it will be an ongoing tool. So part of the idea here is to repurpose unused operating funds each year, or a portion of them, to offset the need for an override, for an operational override for the following year. And that is a true statement to be applied in any year in the future once the tax mitigation stabilization fund has been created this year if it passes. That's one. Two is, I just wanted to remind everyone that through our budgeting process, we've necessarily had to assume that our new growth and economic development initiatives will play out as they have, and in a way that we currently know. What we can't do is assume in our modeling efforts that we're going to create significant new growth over the next 4 years. However, that is absolutely our plan. Robert, our ATA of operations and the head of our economic development efforts, met just this morning with the South Shore Coalition, spoke at length with representatives from A.W. Perry, who own a good portion of the Hingham Industrial Park. And all of those efforts, along with some other large property owners in South Hingham and elsewhere, we're very much hoping will pay dividends between now and FY28, so that we can utilize some of that new growth to, again, offset the need for operational overrides in 28 and beyond, which is exactly how the town avoided overrides from the prior 10, 20 years, when we were getting things like large residential developments. Avalon comes to mind. The property up at the end of Beale Street comes to mind in recent years. That it's the development of those properties that the town was able to utilize the new growth from in order to avoid operational overrides in relatively recent past. So there's a number of initiatives, Bill, hanging out there. I think economic development and new growth is certainly at the top of that list. There's also some legislative opportunities that we're researching. We're working closely with our state rep and others to try to bring outside, both non-local tax money, so non-property tax money, back into Hingham, as well as programs like, as Liz pointed out, the naming bylaw and some of the other articles that we have identified this year to try to bring in some private funds as well. So,
Tom, thanks very much.
Can I just add to
did
that?
I forget one?
No,
Yes,
that
go
was
ahead.
no, it was a great point. And you did mention non-tax opportunities and non-override opportunities. So one thing I just wanted to add to that is there is a bill right now looking to increase the meals tax. So we are working with Senator O'Connor and Representative Miskino on that to follow that. That could certainly be beneficial for Hingham. So just another example, Tom.
Yeah, right.
All right, I am looking at the attendees list. I do not see anyone with a raised hand, and I do not see any additional. Oh, here we go. All right. One just came up.
Can you hear me?
Gail,
hear
good evening. Gail, could
Hi.
you state your name and address for the record,
Yes.
please?
Gail Faring, 14 Cross Street. I just have one point that I feel is constructive criticism. On page 33, all of your override information is there. I think it would be beneficial for John Q. Public to see the 6 million in one column and the 1,875,000 in the other column. Because when you're talking about the numbers that you went through on your slides, they don't tie into these numbers. And I myself was looking for the dollar amounts that you were showing on your slides to show up on this page. I'm kind of anal retentive when it comes to things like that. That's just a constructive criticism. And I appreciate all your work. Thank you.
Gail, thank you for the comment. I believe, Tom, I think we're going to have our slide deck posted on our website, correct?
Will be, yes.
Okay, so Gail, the information you saw tonight is going to be posted publicly.
Okay.
So if you want to refer to that, feel free and we can answer any follow-up questions as well. But thank you for the comment.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, does anyone else have any questions or comments? Okay, the AdCom report is helpful for Gail's question. Thank you for pointing that out. The AdCom report is also helpful, Gail, if you want some more insight into it. Appreciate that. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just give it a couple seconds here to see if anybody else wants to ask a question or comment before we conclude. Michelle, do you want to make a point?
It's just a plug for our coffee chats this Saturday. Just thinking if folks are online and think of a question later or don't want to ask something here, a number of us, myself, everyone on, well, not everyone on this call, myself, Bill, Ness, Joe, Liz, are going to be sitting outside or inside the local coffee shops around town on Saturday morning, April 15th, from about 8 o'clock. I don't want to commit anybody to 7:30. I might be there earlier. So probably between like 8 a.m. and 10:30. If people want to stop by just for casual conversation or ask questions about it, we'd love to see you.
Michelle, thanks for mentioning that.
Sure.
Okay. Lastly, in addition to Michelle's question about Michelle's comment about meeting us over the weekend, people can still reach out to the select board with questions. We have an override website set up. We have an email address. Tom had it up earlier, but you can go to the select board website and you can find that email address, or you can email one of us as well, and we will get you an answer. But I want to thank everybody for the participation tonight. It was wonderful to see a lot of attendees on this Zoom session, and I hope everybody has a good evening. With that, I would take a motion to adjourn the select board.
I move we adjourn.
Second,
All those in favor, Joe,
Aye.
Liz,
aye.
and I'm an aye as well. The select board is adjourned. Hope everybody has a good evening. We'll see you at town meeting in a couple days. Take care, everybody.
Take care.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone, very much. Good night.